I'm Pastor Omar, and this is your meditation for Good Friday, April 10th, 2020. This is Holy Week, and we are making our way through this week asking the question of what kind of king is Jesus? And yesterday we looked at Holy Thursday, the Maundy Thursday, or when Jesus was at his last meal with his disciples and showed this amazing role of servant leadership where he washed the feet of his disciples. I just wanted to add a short addendum to the Holy Thursday meditation. I have heard in the past sometimes the idea of servant leadership used in the corporate world, and I just wanted to give a word of caution. The couple times I've heard it used, and I couldn't think of the exact time and place, but it was a management team that was talking about this to a group of employees. And the only reason I bring caution with this is because it's very easy for us to corrupt anything. We can take the teachings of Jesus, and this can be corrupted on a personal level, on an institutional level, and it's very easy to use this idea of servant leadership as a way to ensure compliance by employees or students or even family members. And so we have to be very careful. What I think is beautiful about that story is that Jesus didn't tell his disciples, you need to go out and have this attitude of servanthood. He modeled it. Jesus was the one that before he spoke a single word, he washed everybody's feet. And if it wasn't that Peter had been so insistent on an explanation, I don't think Jesus would have given an explanation. He was just going to wash feet. So leadership, servant leadership begins with the leadership. It begins with the clergy, with the lay leadership in a church. It begins with us, quote unquote, at the top, because we're really not at the top. That's Jesus's point. And so it's very important that we understand that this is never supposed to be used as a tool of compliance, that we try to keep people in line by kind of encouraging a kind of submissive, subjective population. That is corrupting what Jesus was doing. What Jesus was doing is a lot more radical than this. Jesus was inviting all of us into an intimacy that, to be honest with you, is something we're not used to. Jesus was inviting us into an attitude of service for one another in which we divest ourselves of power and share power, and in which we serve one another in compassion and love. And that really is the goal of the church, and that's why that is such a challenge on every level. Nevertheless, that's the kind of king we serve, a king that came to serve like Jesus did. And that was our lesson for yesterday. Today, we are going to look at Good Friday. I don't really know the origins of Good Friday. I've tried to find, and I think it's still a little murky. This may come from the German God's Friday, but it is the day that we stop and commemorate then the next event that happened on on the Friday of the week of Jesus' Passion. And it is the trial of Jesus, his crucifixion and his death. One of the things that happens here is that Jesus is brought before Pilate. And in the reading that I'm going to do in a minute here, we will hear about we're only going to be able to look at one little part of this, which is Jesus' trial before Pilate. Now, Good Friday comes to us in watches of the day, from noon to about 9 in the morning, from dawn, early in the morning, to about 9 a.m., from 9 a.m. to noon, from noon till about 3, and then from 3 to about 6 p.m. And we're only going to look at what happened in the very early hours of the day when Jesus is brought before Pilate. After he is led away from Caiaphas, there were a lot of jurisdictions here, including the high priest, Pilate, and King Herod, who was not Jewish, but was king over this area. And so I will be reading from the Gospel of John, the 18th chapter, verses 28 through 19, verse 4. And I'll be reading from the Common English Version, the account of Jesus' trial before Pilate. Okay, so the leaders led Jesus from Caiaphas to the Roman governor's palace, and it was early in the morning, and the Jewish leaders would not enter into the palace. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What charge do you bring against this man?" And they said to him, If he has done nothing wrong, we would not have handed him to you. In verse 33, Jesus is brought before Pilate, and he questions him, and Pilate says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered, "Well, do you say this on your own, or have others spoken to you about me?" And Pilate responds and says, "Your nation and your chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" And Jesus replied and said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my guards would fight so that I wouldn't have to be arrested. My kingdom isn't from here." "So," said Pilate, "you are a king." And Jesus said, "You say that I am a king. I was born and I came into the world for this reason, to testify to the truth. And whoever accepts the truth listens to my voice." And Pilate asked, "What is truth?" Okay, so we have here the account of Jesus being brought before Pilate. And Pilate begins to review the charges. Now remember, Jesus was handed over as for a trial of blasphemy. And there was many aspects of this trial, but none more important than the fact of treason. Later on in the trial, it's brought out that if Jesus is a king, doesn't that kingdom encroach on the emperor? And there was no room for treason in the Roman Empire. And so Jesus was looked at both with suspicions in the religious world as well as with suspicions in the political arena as being a threat to the emperor. And indeed, Jesus acknowledges this. So Jesus says, "I am a king." So he doesn't say, "Yeah, I'm apolitical." He says, "No, I am a king," but he says, "My kingdom is not of this world." Again, what this means and what it doesn't mean. When Jesus says that this kingdom is not of this world, it does not mean that the reign of God, the reign that Jesus proclaims, cannot manifest itself in this world, that we cannot be a part of it, live it, experience it, that it does not have an actual way in which we can express this. Of course, it can be in this world. So not of this world, I think, means that it is in contrast to the values of this world. There's different kinds of kingdoms, and to see the kind of kingdom in which Jesus displays power is supposed to be a very stark example from the way we as humans do it. This is what makes what happened in the upper room so important. This is what makes this statement of Jesus so important. What kind of king was Jesus? Jesus was the kind of king that came into this world to bear witness to the truth, God's truth, all right, to express this in the world. And this truth is very often going to be something that we're going to find that is going to be incompatible with our desires and with our with who we are, with our passions, with our decision making, with the things that we value. So I've given some examples of this in the past. You know, if we look at Jesus' sermons, for example, his teaching, Jesus spoke about being poor in spirit and hungering and thirsting for justice. Jesus spoke about being merciful. Jesus spoke about the pure in heart, the meek, right, in the Sermon on the Mount. All of those things are very different than the kind of kingdom that we usually value, which is power, raw power. You know, we are going to coerce people's will. Wealth, prestige, greed, money, honor, you know, honor me over other people. That's the difference here between Jesus' kingdom and the kingdom of this world. And Jesus says, I come to show and to exhibit what God's truth always was. And folks, there is not two truths out there. There is only God's truth. And this is the contrast, and this is the choice that we are faced with. Very often what we like to do is to change Jesus, make Jesus into our own image, or perhaps tame Jesus, or make Jesus' teachings somehow take the sting or the bite out of them. And we have to be, well, we can't do that. I mean, if we want to see the truth of God expressed in the person of Jesus Christ, then it is emphatic that we look at the Gospels and we let Jesus speak and see how Jesus acted. So when we see Jesus healing the lepers and healing the blind and caring for the poor and taking the little children in his lap and saying, this is what the kingdom of heaven is like a little child, and you have to become like a little child. When we look at all of these things that Jesus does in his life and his ministry, Jesus was testifying to the truth of God. And we have to acknowledge that very often that truth challenges us, that truth comes into conflict with how we actually want to live. And we, I think, like Pilate, desire to perhaps wash our hands of Jesus. Pilate kind of, and again, this is just my interpretation on this text, but I kind of feel that Pilate is trying to get out of this and sort of saying, well, you know, the crowd that gathers, the religious leaders, you know, all these other people are kind of compelling me to sentence Jesus over to death. Pilate had this authority. Granted, Jesus even mentions that the authority that Pilate has is only an authority that comes from God, and he can't do anything outside of God's authority, which is a great acknowledgement on Jesus' part. But Pilate could have let Jesus go here. And now, of course, I think ultimately this was not going to be in the plan of God. But what's even more important is for us to recognize that very often we get caught in the grip of this kind of greater, bigger system in which we're a part of. And people have often felt this way, that you sort of feel that you're being carried along, and you may not agree with decisions that are being made by leadership. You may not agree by decisions that are being made. This could be true of a company, a corporation, a government, a nation, a church, an institution, educational institution. And you see an injustice being done, and you know it's an injustice, but the political pressure around you from people is such that nobody else seems to be speaking out about it. Nobody else seems to be willing to take the bait or to get up and say something. And when they do, there's consequences to those individuals. And so people feel compelled, sort of stuck in this, you know, this movement that's heading somewhere. And we are complicit. You know, we become guilty by default, whether we like it or not, because of our silence. And Pilate kind of plays this role here. He's kind of saying, well, I'm washing my hands of Jesus. I think he's innocent, but, you know, clearly I can't let him go. That's something all of us need to consider this Holy Week, because the temptation is too often when we see injustices is for us to stay silent about those injustices. And there are so many things in this world that we as Christians are called to speak out on, and that we are called to be in solidarity with the poor, the alien, and the immigrants in our midst that the Bible talks about. We have to have an honor and a sanctity for all human life that we value and cherish. We have to live in a way that is marked by humility towards one another. You know, all of these Christian values that is who Jesus was, and it's about his kingdom, and it's about his kingship, is what we as Christians are called to live into. But this comes into conflict with the world. And again, we say world, but we're talking about, in essence, other people. We're talking in essence about other interests. We're talking about other, other kings and other lords that have great power, appear to have great power in this world. Now, in Jesus' case, of course, God is always sovereign. And so Jesus ultimately is going to be tried and found guilty and crucified, and the sentence will be carried out. A lot of times I think we as Christians forget that we actually worship a convicted criminal. Now, I've had people kind of be shocked by that when I mentioned that before, but Jesus was convicted in a court of law. And at least in this country, every single time that I've brought up the fact that somebody was convicted by a court of law, it always seems to be the consensus that when the court of law speaks, you're guilty, whether you really were or weren't. We as humans, the courts in the religious courts and the government of Rome and the Empire of Rome sentenced Jesus to death, and Jesus died a convicted criminal. But aren't you glad that that wasn't the last word? And this is, again, where we as Christians acknowledge that there is a higher authority in this universe, and that is God. And God had the last word. And so when we celebrate Easter and when we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus, you have to imagine once again that for those followers of Jesus who loved him dearly, this was the death of not just Jesus, the person that they knew. This was the death of everything that Jesus had preached and taught, the love he had shown to the lepers and the poor and the sick, the ministry that he had for those 3 years of preaching the reign of God. It looks on every level as if Rome and the political powers of Jerusalem had carried the day. Jesus was condemned. One more innocent person, as a miscarriage of human justice, was taken care of by the empire. So, of course, that's the joy of Easter, when the disciples approach the tomb and when they get the news that Jesus is risen. In the words of New Testament scholar N.T. Wright, God vindicated Jesus. I love that word, vindication, because what God was saying was, no, Jesus was innocent, and his kingdom is an eternal kingdom. And in spite of all of our machinations, in spite of all of our plottings as humans, all of this was necessary for the salvation of the world and for the rescue of humanity. And so Jesus' resurrection is God's stamp of approval on the life of Jesus and on his ministry and on his kingdom. So Jesus represents God's truth. Jesus represents that which cannot be killed or destroyed, which is eternal, which is the truth that God brings. And again, I know I mentioned this, but I'll just repeat it one more time in closing. If you want to see this truth, you must see Jesus first and foremost. When Jesus, his teaching, when Jesus acts, his love, his compassion for the marginalized, for the poor, for the outcast, for the aliens and the immigrants, for the widows, Jesus' compassion for all people, his teaching on the kingdom of God and the reign of God and what that looks like on the Sermon on the Mount, all of that embodies in the Gospels what Jesus was about and the truth of God that we as Christians are called to submit to. And yes, again, as has been the theme this week, that is a challenge for us. That challenges us. And so this Good Friday, I want to lovingly try to encourage you to open your hearts and your life and your thinking to embrace the truth of God that is found in Jesus Christ. As hard as it is to do, we are simply asked to do two things, and that will be the subject of our Easter video. We are asked to respond, and that's what we'll be talking about. So I hope that you will be encouraged to understand that Jesus' kingship was one of truth, God's truth, eternal truth. This is what is right. This is God's will. This is the divine will of God that was exhibited in Jesus Christ. And even though we as humans attempted to squelch this, attempted to destroy this, and attempted to extinguish this, we were not able to, because God's love is supreme, and because God's compassion and mercy and grace is eternal and is for all people, and it's exhibited in this world in many different places. And so I hope that you will open your life and your heart on this Holy Week to begin the journey of understanding God's truth in Jesus Christ, and not respond as Pilate did by simply washing our hands of injustice, but that we would make rather a commitment like Jesus to stand for injustice, to stand against injustice, and to stand for justice wherever we see it. Once again, if you like this video, hit like, hit subscribe. If you are not subscribed to this channel, share this video if you think this is something that might be a blessing to other people. And may you go this day in the grace and in the love of Jesus Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit, go in God's peace.